Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. When we think about social welfare, it's pretty easy to just picture a patchwork of totally disconnected government programs. But what happens when you actually map those programs directly onto the human lifespan? Well, today, we're doing exactly that. We're looking at some fascinating source materials that detail the structural approaches to family and social welfare in Bangladesh. We're essentially taking a magnifying glass to see how a developing nation engineers support literally from the cradle all the way to the twilight years. It's a genuinely brilliant lens for understanding human development.
To make sense of this massive, interconnected system, we're just going to follow the human experience chronologically. So our agenda is to start with family needs, then move to nurturing the next generation, empowering women, steps toward true equality, and finally, caring for the elderly. Let's get right into it. Section 1. Family needs and physiological basics. We absolutely have to start at the bedrock of any society, and that's the fundamental physiological needs of the family unit. Before we can even begin to talk about things like self-actualization or economic empowerment, we have to quantify exactly what it takes to simply sustain human life. The raw data we're looking at strictly quantifies survival. It breaks down exact daily nutritional requirements. We're talking calories, protein, calcium, iron, and specific vitamins, all meticulously delineated by precise age brackets, genders, and physical states. For instance, the data shows exactly how a pregnant or nursing mother requires a specific, quantified spike in protein and calories compared to your average adult. Biological needs are absolutely not one size fits all, and honestly, any effective welfare system has to be built on this kind of highly specific, data-driven foundation. This just beautifully illustrates a really simple truth. Social welfare cannot be static. It has to dynamically adapt to the physical realities of citizens at every single stage of their lives. You can't just issue a blanket food policy and expect it to work equally for a rapidly growing teenager, a nursing mother, and a sedentary senior citizen, right? The source text really emphasizes that understanding these dynamic shifts, like how the natural physical decay of old age demands completely different vitamins and minerals for tissue repair, is the absolute prerequisite for any state planning. Moving right along to Section 2, Nurturing the Next Generation Through Child Development. Let's see how this foundation builds when we look at the most vulnerable folks among us, our kids.
Once those basic caloric needs are met, the complexity of human development scales up incredibly fast. Now, physical imperatives like a disaster-free home, regular food, and access to medicine, those keep a child alive. But the psychological side is just as crucial. The source documentation places equal structural weight on psychological needs like experiencing peer trust and developing leadership to actually shape a fully functional adult.
Think about these invisible psychological milestones. If we ignore them, like, say, building basic trust at 18 months, or later on, peer socialization, we totally fail to socially integrate the child. Tracking these developmental stages is quite literally a cornerstone of systemic welfare. Because if a child is deprived of an environment to practice leadership or socialize with peers, they're really going to struggle to become an active, engaged citizen later on in life.
Which brings us to Section 3, Empowering Women and Their Economic Awakening. As those kids grow, the family structure relies heavily on its anchors. Here, we see the active interventions the state is making to fundamentally shift societal structures. Just take a second to process this number. 82,500. That is the number of women trained across 6 different trade skills through a targeted project explicitly designed to develop female entrepreneurs. And this training isn't just generic stuff. The documentation shows they're training women in everything from business management to, surprisingly enough, mushroom cultivation. The goal here is really simple but incredibly profound, taking disadvantaged and unemployed women and turning them into self-reliant, income-generating forces within the broader economy.
And the momentum doesn't stop there. Add another 42,206 educated but unemployed women receiving district-based computer and IT training to participate in the digital economy. We're looking at comprehensive 6-month-long courses covering office applications, graphic design, and multimedia. This is a very deliberate structural shift. It ensures women aren't just relegated to traditional manual labor, but are fully equipped to enter the modern, tech-driven workforce, even taking on freelance outsourcing right from their own homes. So you can see the government isn't just handing out aid. They are fundamentally restructuring society. You've got the JHADA program providing actual, physical market spaces for female entrepreneurs to sell their goods. You have expansive microcredit for self-employment, comprehensive training for income-generating activities, and absolutely critical safety nets, like maternity allowances. This ensures a mother's health is never sacrificed just for economic survival.
Now for Section 4, Steps Toward True Equality Through Systemic Safety Nets. Because as we know, economic power is really only half the equation.
Handing a woman a microloan or a computer certificate really isn't enough if the society around her isn't actually safe. Over time, the state's approach has clearly evolved. Early interventions focused heavily on immediate survival, literally handing out 30-kilogram packages of food for vulnerable group development. But as the state develops, it advances toward things like that IT training we just talked about, and highly sophisticated referral systems for crisis intervention. They're implementing specialized cells for violence prevention, setting up formal legal aid, and enforcing strict guidelines against sexual harassment.
The huge takeaway here is that an empowered woman still absolutely needs a supportive legal and social environment to thrive without fear of marginalization. It's a dual-pronged approach, right? You push hard for economic independence on one side, but you absolutely must build an ironclad legal fortress to protect that independence on the other.
And finally, Section 5, Caring for the Elderly and the Vulnerabilities of Aging. As we reach the end of the human life cycle, the nature of welfare has to drastically pivot all over again. It's often the quietest, yet most heartbreaking stage of the human arc.
We have to shift our focus away from just physical health to a pretty stark reality. Aging in modern society often completely strips away a person's lifelong identity. The source texts vividly describe how the elderly suffer intense psychological distress simply because they suddenly lose their authority within the family. Think about it. They transition from being the primary decision makers to suddenly feeling like a burden. This overwhelming feeling of uselessness, combined with deep anxiety about where they'll live and who will care for them, creates a profound psychosocial crisis. It's a crisis that requires highly specialized welfare attention.
It's also a deeply sobering paradox. As families modernize, our elders might be physically sheltered, but they are increasingly suffering from an invisible, crushing isolation. As society shifts from traditional, large joint families to much smaller nuclear families, the elderly are often just left behind. Even if they are living in the exact same house as their kids, the growing generation gap and the painful loss of their own peers leave them feeling entirely disconnected and profoundly lonely.
When you lay out the challenges, it becomes painfully clear why a comprehensive support system is needed as those traditional family structures begin to fracture. The elderly face a sudden lack of direction and respect after retirement. They often fall into poverty as their earning stops, becoming entirely economically dependent. Add to that housing instability as nuclear families understandably prioritize their own immediate children, and the fact that all of this is happening while their physical health is rapidly declining. It's a perfect storm. So as our society develops economically, how will we ensure our most vulnerable are absolutely never left behind? I want to leave you with that provocative thought to chew on regarding the true measure of our societal progress. We've seen just how incredibly complex and dynamic human needs are, from the exact caloric intake of a toddler to the economic integration of women, all the way to the psychological isolation of the elderly. A society is ultimately only as strong as the safety nets it weaves for its people at every single one of these stages. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive through the human life cycle arc. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will catch you in the next explainer.